So the first thing we're going to take a look at is weighting. And there's an entirely separate weight system and U and V coordinate system set up for the clones. In order to see this, we need to select the cloner object, and under Transform we have a display. We can select the weight, the UV, or the color modifier. All three of these are specific and directly tied to the cloner object and the effectors. It's all part of MoGraph. So it has nothing to do with any point weights you have set up or any UV textures or really any of the colors you have set up either for the materials. If an object doesn't have a material, it will inherit the color changes from the effectors or the color setup for the main cloner. We're going to set this to the weight to begin with, and if we look underneath the terrain, we can start to see red dots showing, which is the weight, the initial weight. Because we don't really see that on the main object, we may need to set up a display tag for the clones to be X-rated. So let's go to display tag. So right click on the object, send 4D tag, select display, and this we're not going to be using just yet, just having it ready for when we need to increase the level of detail or change maybe over to box mode. If we select the main object, we can go to basic and select X-ray. So now we're seeing more of a transparent clone, and we can see those little weight dots showing. So right now there is an initial weight set up for the cloner object. So if we go to the transform, we can see and transform the weight. Lowest point of the weight is going to be red, and the highest point is going to be yellow. So it's going to show just like any other point weight. Now the initial mode is going to be important if we have less than 100% modified weight value for any of the effectors. So we're going to start, and the first thing we're going to take a look at is setting up placement of these trees. And we're going to use an effector to modify the weight. So we're going to start in the Object tab and increase the amount of clones we have so that we're working with something a little bit denser. I'm going to set it to 1,000. So now we have 1,000 clones, and they're being varied throughout the 3 different clones available. I'm also going to rearrange my clone order so that I have the brightest first, and then kind of a descent down to some of the darker ones. So just moving and having 2 first, then 3, and then just the original previous object. So for the placement, we're going to start with the shader effector. And what we're going to do is add in from the MoGraph menu, shader effector, and select cloner effectors and drag that shader effector into there. Right now, since the initial setup for the shader is going to be the scale, I'm going to turn off scale for now. And we need to set up our shader. What I'm going to do is select a noise and set this to object space, and stick with the scale at 100 for the moment. But what we're going to end up using is this noise to modify the weight. So if we go to the parameter tab, we can select the weight transform. So all of those options where we had displays for, the color, which is going to show right here, color mode is currently on. I'm going to turn it off because we're not using it at the moment. We have the U and the V, which can be transformed, the modify clone, which has to do with the sort order of the clones and where they're placed, and then the weight transform. So if I increase the weight transform to 100%, And moving down to the bottom of the object so that we can see that a little bit better, you can start to see the changes in the weight and all of those points. So it's no longer just that constant color. If we go back to the main cloner object, go to transform, setting up the initial weight, in this case, because we're set to 100, won't have any change. Now, the way we're going to set this up is as an inherited value. So in other words, we're going to define the weight before we define anything else, and then use this weight to control another effector, which is a really good setup and system to be able to control things in the weight order or the shader order, the effectors, and the way they're placed within the object, especially if you have any animated effects, are really, really important. The shading of this is going to be directly tied to, of course, this noise that's set up. So as I increase the contrast amount, we're going to see more of an influence and brighter colors and effects on the weight. So if you want more in-between values, you would reduce contrast to have a softer blend, increase contrast in order to output a higher value. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale of this to 150. Also keep in mind that the brightness amount will change the overall output, although it is easier just to modify the weight setting. So at the moment, because we're affecting the weight with this shader, it may or may not deform in the same manner. In other words, we can set up a scaling that is controlled by the weight, controlled by the shader itself. The weight at the moment currently has no effect on the object because nothing is using it. How you define the weight is based on the fall-off amount and adjusting that weight setting. This, in this case, is based on the initial startup value because basically the transformations are applied before the weight is applied. So if we want to set up a scale based on the weight and not on the shader, what we need to do is add in a new object and a new type of effector. We could use a random effector, but I'm going to choose to use a step effector, and we're going to go to the cloner object, and under the effector list, we're going to add in the step effector. If we go to the step effector, we're going to modify the scale. I'm going to set this to absolute. I'm going to turn on the absolute scale, which is set on the bottom. That's going to prevent the objects from inverting and going into negative scale values, which is really important when you're controlling and using the visibility, which subtracts the amount of objects being shown. Now, if we go to the fall off, we can take that weight and turn it down to 0. So we also need to change and create what's going to be our modifying scale setting. And now if we adjust based on weight, we can have a direct link to just the weight setup, which is really nice. So any modifications we make to the weight before it reaches the step effector are going to directly affect the weight fall off. Setting it to 0 is going to basically use the direct weight that's currently in effect. And if we invert it, we can control in the other direction. So I'm going to set this to visibility, which is going to show just and we'll go ahead and take a look, and looks like the higher points of the weight, and it's going to cut away at the rest of the object. So if we go back to the shader, select the shading, and we can modify our scale and reduce some of those patches or increase them. and then increasing the contrast is going to give us a more finite amount. But it will reduce the amount of scaling variation because that is based on the weight amount. So if you want to just control the placement and not the scaling yet, go to the cloner object and just turn off, or go to the step effector, turn off the scale. So now we're just affecting the placement based on the visibility. Another thing to keep in mind is that the effector minimum and maximum value will allow you to move within that weight. And it's really going to show a better output based on the shader by bringing the minimum down further. In this way, we're basically cutting out most of the lower values. If we take down the maximum and bring both of these down to -100, we have only the higher points of the only the lower points of the weight showing. If we want to do the opposite, we can invert the fall off. So now we have the upper value of the weight, and what's going to be the highest point, which is yellow. And as you can see, because we have such a harsh cutoff, once we start to modify the slider, it will show everything. So this is a really cool way to modify the placement. Once again, because it's such a finite amount, we don't really have the ability to adjust the scale equally. So if you chose to, instead of using the step effector to control the scale, use the shader, which has no weight influence except after the transformation, we can use the shader and create something that's going to conform a little bit better. So turning on the scale within the shader effector, this is also going to be a little different because the contrast is set so high. So what we can do is go to the shading and just turn down the contrast. If we can adjust the brightness amounts and just kind of paying attention to the weight. Another thing that works pretty well is if we go to the minimum maximum values of the shader itself and change the minimum and maximum values. So if I set the maximum to 0 and the minimum to 100, what we're going to get is more of the inside areas of what would be the density of the forest are going to be larger objects, and around the edges are going to be much smaller objects. So that's going to conform to the weight pretty well. Now if we had the opposite showing on the step effector, so basically going to the fall off and inverting it, we're going to see nothing showing because of the way the minimum and maximum values are set. So we might need to set the maximum to 0 to reflect just about the same thing, and then bring the minimum amount up. And that actually looks a little bit closer with that setup. Now the shader effector also has visibility, which really isn't going to show because we are already subtracting with the step effector. But if we were to turn off the step effector, then turn on visibility for the shader, at this point it's going to disappear because of the way our maximum and minimum values are set. So we could also control the density directly with the shader instead of relying on the weight. But the weight's still available to affect all of the additional effectors after it. So depending on how many changes you need to make to the objects, you have all of these available options for the weight setups and just the direct modifications based on visibility and so on, to give you really a lot of control over the order in which they're applied. So what I want to do is now fill in these absent areas and use the step effector for that. And since we have the weight set up carried over from the shader, currently, go ahead and take a look at the step. We can turn on the visibility so that we're showing or cutting out the additional objects. And we see these very large objects showing somewhat in between. So making sure the fall off is at 0, and really depending on if it's inverted or not for the initial placement because of the way the effector settings are set up is going to modify that intensely. So if we change the minimum and maximum values, setting them both to 100 to rely on that part of the weight, we start to fill it in a little bit more. And change the scale. So if we turn off visibility and the inversion, we can have a little more scaling showing up. For the most part, we're not filling in the additional area because we've already cut out those points of the clones. And when there are no clones showing, that means that you really won't be able to add anything additional too much to those areas because you've already set the visibility to cut them out. So if we wanted to fill these areas that don't have anything in them, we need to go to the shader and turn off the visibility, which is cutting them out. And then we can go to the step effector and modify those minimum and maximum values in order to fill it in a little bit more, and then we can modify the scale. Now for the most part, we still have a very equal distribution. So if we wanted to have more objects showing within those other areas, we need to rely on another type of effector or another type of clone in addition to the current clone to fill it in. So let's look at one way we can do that. Go to the shader, turn the visibility back on, and now we have the setup for the step effector, modifying the scales. We can turn on the visibility, and because the way the minimum and maximum values are showing up, we do have some additional objects in the bottom portion coming back. So it is modifying the visibility enough in this case to get those objects to come back. So in this case, we could also modify the weight within those other areas to increase them a little bit more. And in this case, we only see the objects when visibility is turned on because we have the inverted fall-off, which is going to be the opposite weight setup. But let's take a look at filling in these other areas. So we're going to go over to the step effector, and we can leave it the way it is or adjust some of these additional values. So the way this is set up now, we can make those smaller fill-in areas, but we want it much denser. There's a lot of ways to do this, really depending on how the initial clones are placed onto the object. Right now we don't have a selection set up. This is kind of an overall placement. So we can't really rely on increasing polygon amounts. What we need to do is have another effector. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove the step effector for now, just relying on the shader, and now we want to create a much denser variety of clones. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste the cloner object to create a duplicate. And we want to have a different set of effectors on this cloner object. So I'm going to remove the shader. Now technically, one thing we could do is just duplicate the shader as well and invert it. But then we're going to end up with a lot of additional effectors that we may or may not need. and it might be harder to separate all of that from the scene later. So we're still set up to clone these objects on the terrain, but I want to set up a new effector, and what I'm going to use is the volume effector. And I'm going to turn off the scale for now, and keep in mind too that this cloner also has its own independent weight from the other one, although it's still being modified from the shader effector. So for the volume, the effector settings have a volume object setting. So we can effect from, or set up, say, a sphere, and add that as a volume object to affect this. But a really nice thing we can do is just rely on the fall-off setting. So if we go to the fall-off tab of the volume effector and just select a source, the source can be the first clone. So we also need to reduce the scale. So going to the Transform tab of the duplicated cloner object, making the transform much smaller objects so we can just see those showing. We also want to increase the count because we want to increase the density. So we can do 3,000 of them. And right now they're still showing within the other objects. So we're going to go back to the volume effector, and under the parameters, turn on the visibility. And then the fall-off function, we can change. And we also need to make sure that that volume effector is showing in the effectors list. So going to the cloner object and dragging the volume in. If you have the cloner object selected, when you add in the effector, it will add it to the list, which means you can also select multiple cloners, add in an effector, and it will add them all to the list. If not, you can also select them all and drag stuff into the lists. So now we see an entirely different turnout. I'm going to turn off visibility. And then we can see all the objects showing. So now we need to get them back. So depending on the fall-off amount, we can set it to step and invert it, and now modify the sample distance from the other objects. So in other words, how closely we want to place these other objects to the source link or the other clones. So that's a pretty nice way to fill in those additional areas and attract two other clones without having to rely on the other shaders or the influenced weights, since we don't even have the other shader effector in the list, because that would also remove these objects from that area because it does not have an independent invert per cloner object. It's also important to keep in mind that when you switch between the linear and the step mode, the invert is different. Which also means we have an attract and a repel object influence within the same effector. So if we just select invert, we can choose to repel the object and populate or place the objects in between the other clones, or closer to them, and start to fill it in. With animated effectors, the step mode can sometimes produce additional objects that you may not want. So if you're going to be animating this addition of objects, it's usually a good idea to use the linear. And like I said, if you need to do the opposite, just select the invert. Also, you can adjust the fall-off amount, so the overall influence after the sample distance is showing. Once you reach a certain point, the fall off may not work, especially with the step. It might reduce the amount of objects being created too much. In this case, this setup seems to be working pretty well with the fall off. There are a lot of different fall off options you can use. You can also set up a spline. So if we want to control that with a spline, it can sometimes be a little bit easier. To see a preview of what they all do, you can right-click on the fall off function, show the help. Actually, it looks like that was not part of the help. So what we can do is we'll just select the deformation, show the help, and we should be able to get a fall off from the list. There is a nice little list for the MoGraph module that's going to show the effectors and the fall off for all of the effectors. So in this case, we're using a volume, although it shouldn't really matter. But we can go to the fall off option, and it will give us a preview of what all of the different fall off options will do. So to give you a little bit of a better idea, even seeing in this preview, you can see how the step would create objects, and then in the negative values create additional ones where that hole would normally be. So you can see the difference between the linear and the step, which is why sometimes when you're animating this, if you want them to be removed, they might show up outside of the volume.